So could they test for this? Did you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, they can, but does the FDA allow it? Probably not. So that's the dilemma, is
Hmm.
that this is another form of ferroxidase enzyme function.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the two most important enzymes on planet Earth are in complex 4 of the mitochondria. Cytochrome C oxidase allows us to work with oxygen,
Mm-hmm.
and ferroxidase prevents rust.
I see.
Those are the two most important enzymes on the planet, and neither one of them is a regular part of any blood panel. And it's a really good question to ask: why?
Mm-hmm.
Why wouldn't we have that? And that would be a very primal understanding about whether our body is working or not, and it would really help us to manage this condition called diabetes, which we'll get into.
Yeah. So how do these? Because you were saying before the show, that before we started recording, that this whole business of insulin and all this stuff related to diabetes is just sort of like this old information, or it's just not completely accurate, right?
Well, it isn't necessarily old information. It's where all the optics are.
Okay.
Everything's about, oh, you're insulin resistant.
Uh huh.
Well, let's move the focus back a few years. Um, I came across some very interesting research from the early 1970s by Dr. Fell, who's a noted biologist in England, studying farm animals. It's always interesting. There's no disease on the farm. Plants don't have disease, and animals don't have disease. They just have mineral deficiencies.
Right.
But the farmers have disease, right? Because they believe their doctor, right?
Yeah. Totally.
So the Dr. Fell was studying copper deficiency in animals on the farm,
Okay.
and the first thing he talks about is the animals who are copper deficient have a breakdown of their pancreas.
Okay.
I was like, what? I've read a lot of articles. I spend 3 hours a day pouring through the literature. I'd never read that.
Yeah.
So I started chasing that bunny trail just a couple weeks ago. And in
Interesting.
fact, Dr. Fell is absolutely right. It was studied very intensively by a Dr. Rao, R-A-O,
Uh
at
huh.
Northwestern University. From 1985 to 1995, that was his focus, was how dependent the pancreas is on copper.
Okay.
So the pancreas is a dual function organ. It has endocrine function that everybody knows about, which secretes insulin,
Uh huh.
but it has something called an exocrine function that makes all of the digestive enzymes that we rely on.
Mm-hmm.
And the way the pancreas sits, it sits right next to, if this is the small intestine, the duodenum,
Mm-hmm.
well, the pancreas is sitting right on top of it.
Okay.
And the cells that are so important in the pancreas are called acinar. A is in Adam, C-I-N-A-R, acinar cells, and they're very energy dependent. They can't do their work without ATP.
Okay.
And if they lose copper, they can't work. And in a series of studies that I was looking at, within 8 weeks of depriving animals of copper, there was a 90% loss of their acinar cells. And just so people understand, the two most important enzymes that the pancreas makes are amylase
Uh huh.
and lipase. Well, amylase is what breaks down carbohydrates,
Mm-hmm.
and lipase is what breaks down fats. Where does the amylase secretion start? When you start to chew your food. And if you have a meal that has a crunch to it, you start to release amylase in your mouth that works its way down your esophagus into your stomach and helps you to break down the food.
Okay.
That doesn't work if you're drinking smoothies. So I always encourage clients to stop drinking smoothies and start drinking chewies. So they have to chew, chew, chew. And that's where it's a very important aspect of digestion. But when the animal loses amylase function, it becomes more reactive to sugar, becomes glucose intolerant. And it turns out that as this process unfolds inside the pancreas,
Mm-hmm.
years before insulin becomes an issue,
Okay.
but as this process unfolds, these acinar cells undergo what's called transdifferentiation.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big word.
Mm-hmm.
And they turn into liver cells. They're called hepatocytes.
Okay.
And you're like, huh? Wait a minute. So these acinar cells
Uh-huh.
that get transformed into hepatocytes, and it begs the obvious question: why would the pancreas start to develop hepatocytes? Well, you have to understand what hepatocytes do inside the liver. They regulate copper. And so the pancreas is desperate to find copper, and it will go to great lengths to make sure it has copper. It will transform its tissue to become copper seeking, copper metabolic, so that it can in fact get its function back. But here's the catch. Once these cells turn into hepatocytes, they can't go back. And then you've lost that ability to make those enzymes.
I see.
And so anyone who has gut dysbiosis probably has pancreatic dysfunction from a lack of copper. Anyone who has leaky gut, a lot of people worry about their leaky gut, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's because the cells, these are the enterocytes,
Mm-hmm.
well, the enterocytes have pulled apart. How do they stay together? By energy. Where does the energy come from? It comes from copper. And so leaky gut, enzyme dysregulation, all because of a lack of copper. And people are probably thinking, well, why is the copper missing? Well, I have a very dear friend now. He was a client who's become a very good friend.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very high profile chemist who, when he came from India to the United States at the age of 22 to go to Hopkins to get his doctorate in chemistry, he adopted the Western diet.
Oh.
And he fell in love with Coca-Cola
Oh yeah.
and didn't know that there was high fructose corn syrup in Coca-Cola. And when he found out there was, he didn't know what the impact was. Well, what does high fructose corn syrup do? It stops the absorption of copper in the intestine and blocks it in every other cell that has the doorway called CTR1,
Mm-hmm.
copper transporter 1. And so that's where diabetes starts, is the lack of copper that affects the pancreas. And when the pancreas loses its ability to break down sugars because it doesn't have amylase,
Uh-huh.
it sends a signal to the endocrine end of the organ,
Okay.
and it says, you better start making a lot of insulin because we got a problem. And that's when you start to have this miscommunication and dysfunction in the pancreas. And what is that insulin doing? Well, that insulin affects gene function, which then prevents the ability to make and function with ceruloplasmin.
Mm.
And the cells can no longer, the tissue can no longer make ceruloplasmin to fight the oxidative stress that's rising in the body that has rising levels of sugar. And there's a direct correlation between rising sugar and rising oxidative stress. And nobody's talking about all that stuff that happens years before you have what's called liver insulin resistance or muscular insulin resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And so we live in a world that obsesses and is preoccupied with iron,
Uh-huh.
has no vision for copper, doesn't understand what copper does inside the body.
Mm-hmm.
And that, let me put it in perspective, Justin. For To be classified an epidemic, 7.7% of the population has to have the same condition.
Okay.
Okay? The percentage of people in the United States that have a sugar disorder, 32%. This is a very serious problem in this country about sugar metabolism disorders. And the scale of it is really big. And we all love our sweets, but we are increasingly inside bodies that don't have the very mineral that allows our body to break down the food that we're eating, especially those sugars.
Now, are you seeing any difference with type 1 and type 2 diabetes? Because everyone I talk to, obviously there's a difference there. But then you get to some of the people that we speak to on a radio show, and they say, I don't care what kind of cancer it is. It's all a dysregulation of the body. It's a metabolic disease, and you can treat a lot of these things the same way. In your research, are you seeing a difference between type 1 and type 2?
Well, the classic distinction between type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is the inability to make insulin.
Right, right.
And type 2 is the inability to handle sugar and to regulate insulin. And then eventually, type 2 develops into a situation where the body is stressed to make insulin. Now, here's where it gets really wicked. You're sitting down, right?
Yeah, I'm sitting down.
You're sitting down, okay.
Yeah.
So I came across a very important study by Dr. Gozileh, Gozileh, 2017, talking about how iron creates diabetes. Like, what? And basically what he says is if you want to create diabetes, add iron. And if you want to stop diabetes, chelate iron. Very, very powerful statement. So then what we find out is that a lot of people who have type 2 diabetes take metformin. You probably have heard that.
Right.
Now, I want you to go out on a limb. You're a smart guy. What metal do you think metformin chelates to perform its function?
Oh, gosh. Copper?
It does chelate copper. And the rationale is, well, this pesky little copper is causing all the problems
Right.
that are called diabetes, when in fact it's entirely iron driven. And so they're robbing the very metal that can stop this chaos. Okay? And then a lot of people take insulin on top of their metformin. And what's that insulin doing? It's only adding to the insult, because there's a gene transporter protein called FOXO, FOXO, and that gets shut down with too much insulin, and then you can't make ceruloplasmin. And so people aren't aware of that. They've never heard of ceruloplasmin. They don't know what it does. The doctor doesn't know what it is, and the doctor's just trying to get the blood sugars down, right? But we're not focusing on the right thing. How did the blood sugars rise in the first place? What happened to the pancreas years ago? And again, in this situation with my friend client, he was drowning himself in Coca-Cola, and he developed non-alcoholic fatty liver disease by the age of 37. And by the time he was 40, he had type 2 diabetes. And he's absolutely fascinated by what he didn't know about the mineral dynamics that affected his pancreas, his liver, and is now affecting his overall health. Because there's a very high correlation between diabetes and heart health, eye health, brain health, bone health, kidney health. It's a gateway for a lot of conditions, as you well know.
Are you seeing a lot of people that have turned around their diabetes, type 1 and type 2, following the root cause protocol?
There are striking examples where people are able to reverse their type 2 diabetes, and it's not just from the root cause protocol. Dr. Wong, Jason Wong, is it Wong or Fung?
Or Fung, yeah, Fung.
Fung, excuse me.
Uh-huh.
Jason Fung has an entire protocol based on fat and lipids.
Hmm.
Another naturopath that I'm familiar with, his name is Stefan Ripich. He's a naturopath in Arizona. He has a wonderful book called The 30-Day Diabetes Cure. And his track record is 100% of his type 2 patients are no longer on insulin, no longer on medication. And 80% of his type 1 patients are able to reduce their insulin. So those are pretty striking statistics that he's kept track of.
Are those
I just think it's
doctors
important for people to realize, to know that
are
there are solutions. Yeah.
are those
Yeah.
doctors understanding of the role of minerals, specifically copper? Do they work with that at all? Do you know? Or
Not that I can see, and I would love to have an opportunity to chat with both of them. And I'm sure there are other practitioners who are focusing on this. But
hmm.
again, what's important here, and I think what you're beginning to really understand now, is the simplicity and the enormity of these minerals, particularly as it relates to our overall health and well-being, and that it's in no way taking away the impact that Dr. Fong or Dr. Ripich are having in their practices, but they can take it down a notch and get into the essence of what are the minerals and what's the mismatch between the minerals that might further enhance the results that they're getting.
How does PUFA, do you think, or magnesium relate to the pancreas health and those enzymes, and copper as well? Do you think they play a role in
Well,
some way?
well, they have to. I mean, um, if all of those cells have a bilipid membrane,
Uh-huh.
and so if the construction of the bilipid membrane isn't right, it's not going to function well. Magnesium is absolutely essential in making energy. Energy is spelled magnesium hyphen ATP.
Hmm.
Magnesium is very important for the enzyme functions, as you know. Anytime anyone gets pancreatitis, that the last four letters in that word are ITIS. It's the iron seeker,
Hmm.
and there's an absolute once the cells lose copper, they start to take on more iron. That's well established in the pancreatic research, and that's the precursor to pancreatitis. And there's a massive loss of magnesium with pancreatitis. Now, what the endocrinologist will tell you, they'll say, the disease came first,
Right, right.
right?
Yeah.
That's exactly what they've been taught,
Hmm.
not knowing that these mineral dynamics allowed the conflict between copper and iron to build to the point where there's this massive inflammatory process that causes massive loss of magnesium, which then destabilizes the health of that organ.
So I'm just curious, like because I know people that have diabetes type 1, both type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and
Right.
probably anyone listening or watching has the same experience. Either they have it themselves or they know someone that does. And
Sure.
I'm just so curious because if you were to, specifically with type 2, because this is much more manageable than type 1, if they
Right.
were to follow the root cause protocol and start going through some of these ways of chelating, getting rid of excess iron, as well as bringing in copper and magnesium, it seems like you'd be well on your way to restoring some sort of homeostasis, right, within the body to be able to deal with that
Right.
insulin or that lack of.
Right. And so the challenge for this client that I keep referring to is that he's been taking medications for 20 years now. And so it's having to deal with that side of it. That the root cause protocol, he's adopted that, feels great. He loves it when he goes to donate blood. He says, I can't believe how much better I feel when I donate blood.
Oh yeah.
Um, and so he's being very dutiful about the protocol and the components of the protocol. What he's now focusing on is working with his doctor to begin to scale back the medications because he's convinced that his body will be able to handle it. And
Hmm.
that's the decision point that everyone's going to have to face with their doctor is,
Hmm.
you know, the mindset of the conventional physician is, well, you're broken, and you're going to need these medications for the rest of your life.
Mm.
And I think the mindset that you and I have and your followers have is that no, the body just wasn't fed right. The tissue needs to be rejuvenated,
Mm-hmm.
and over time that will happen. And is it going to be a complete reversal? Well, ideally, yes. But certainly what Stefan Ripich has found, that for type 2, yes, they do have a complete reversal. I think Dr. Fung has found that same phenomenon with his experience with his patients. So I think there are some striking examples here where, yes, this is in fact possible. Now what we have to do is manage the chemical assault
Mm-hmm.
that's brought into the body by the traditional intervention.
Now, it's interesting because you talked about how antibiotics affect the body's ability to regulate copper, to utilize copper. You talked about ascorbic acid does somewhat the same thing, at least to the enzyme that causes copper to be sort of
Released.
Not usable. And then some other things that sort of screws up copper. Now, I'm wondering if someone's on if they're on diabetic medication, do standard medications also throw off the copper's ability to regulate these things, do you think?
Well, I was studying a glib answer would be yes, but let me qualify it a little bit.
Okay.
I was reading a fascinating article about schizophrenia, and there's a recognized relationship between high serum copper, high copper in the blood, and that condition. And so this research team was studying that with some discipline. They really wanted to see, is there another way to look at this situation? And so they were really focusing on the level of copper, and it absolutely bore out that there was an elevation of copper in these schizophrenic patients. The ceruloplasmin was elevated. That doesn't mean it was active. The level was high, which is an inflammatory response. But they went one step farther than anyone else had ever done. They said, well, let's look at this let's look at this copper inside the spinal fluid, and let's study copper inside the brains of patients who've had schizophrenia but have died. No one had ever done that before.
That's interesting.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
And what they discovered was that the copper in the spinal fluid was perfect.
Okay.
Perfectly normal, exactly where it was supposed to be. And then they went into the research that look at the analysis of minerals in the brains of people with schizophrenia. Perfect copper levels in the brain. And then one of the lead researchers this is in black and white in the article, says it would appear that the antipsychotic medications that we're using is affecting ceruloplasmin and causing copper to rise in the blood. Now, that's a very bold thing for someone to say.
Oh, yeah.
But then it begins to sync up with research that I'm very familiar with around antibiotics, around birth control pills, around hormone replacement therapy, around anti-anxiolytics, all of the benzos. They all blow up copper. And so suddenly we've got this false narrative around high copper in the blood and a disconnect with the copper that's taking place in the central nervous system and inside the brain, and most likely inside the tissue or the organs that are dependent on it. And so there's been this confusion, and I think that to respond to your observation, I think that there is a correlation between these medications. I'm not going to go down the conspiratorial trail and say it was designed that way. I think it's a byproduct. I think it's an unfortunate byproduct, and people need to understand that there is a price to pay with using these meds. And unfortunately, it's a very heavy price, because one of the reasons why Mildred Seelig, who was a world-renowned magnesium expert, left the world of big pharma, is because she discovered that every drug she was studying caused magnesium loss, and that's a fact. And now we're finding out that many of these classes of drugs are causing copper elevation and disrupting the elegance and the importance of bioavailable copper to activate oxygen and deactivate oxidants. And I think that's a much bigger frame of reference than I had ever imagined. But I think your question is really raising an important set of implications that people need to be aware of.
Yeah, and when you think about the fact that we have so much iron, we can't afford to lose any copper, right? I mean, the copper that we have is probably less than we need, and then we're losing what we already have, and so it becomes this kind of cascading effect, right?
Absolutely becomes a cascading effect. And there are agents in farming, agents in food, agents in big pharma that are very disruptive to copper iron metabolism. And then we just have stress in general. Again, that a body under chronic stress will trigger the liver to make an important protein called metallothionein. And what does metallothionein do? It binds up copper 1,000 times stronger than it binds up zinc. Well, that really alters the metabolic vitality of the body. It loses access to the very metal that's essential for allowing us to metabolize oxygen.
So say that once again, Morley. So stress, just so that because I know, for me, when I listen to podcasts, I listen to radio shows all the time, and someone will say something really fascinating, and then I'm kind of doing dishes or something, and I don't quite, so I have to rewind. So you're saying,
are there dishes there? I don't see you doing dishes.
But you're saying that so somehow stress, it creates this enzyme that binds up copper, right? But then it also it lowers your magnesium too. So it's like a double front thing going on, right?
So when we are under acute stress, in a car accident or blunt hit to our head, there's this massive loss of magnesium and a massive loss of B vitamins to respond to that.
Okay.
If in many situations where people have chronic illness, it's a chronic stress. And the body has this mechanism to trigger, the liver triggers the production of metallothionein under this state of chronic stress. Mm-hmm. Basically, what the body is saying is, this organism can't seem to survive, so I'm going to begin to shut it down. Mm-hmm. And it's not being malevolent. It's responding to the signals that it's been trained to respond to. And that protein, metallothionein, will bind up the copper in a very powerful way, and then you've lost access to the very metal that allows you to have true vitality.
That's so interesting. So when it comes to diabetes, then the two main minerals that people want to deal with or actually increase are copper, magnesium, and then lowering iron. That would be the sort of the heart of the root cause protocol, right?
Right. And the other thing that's very important for pancreatic function and for liver function is retinol. I mean, it is an anti-inflammatory agent. It makes copper bioavailable. It enables critical. I just happened to Google it yesterday. That I said ACE in our cells, retinol deficiency. I was like, oh wow. I mean, these cells must have access to retinol. So think of the pancreas as this incredibly important engine for breaking down our food. Well, what do engines need? They all need oil, right? Mm-hmm. And what's the oil for the pancreas? It's called retinol. And again, we've not been trained to think that way because we've been so preoccupied with iron, so preoccupied with calcium, so preoccupied with zinc, and so preoccupied with vitamin D that, wow, we don't have the bandwidth to start thinking about, oh my gosh, I need magnesium and copper and retinol. It's like, and that's really that's the whole basis of the protocol.
So copper, in order for it to be bioavailable and usable, needs retinol. And where do people mostly get retinol?
Don't get it from a supplement bottle, please.
Okay.
The best forms of, and I call it real vitamin A, and it comes from fat,
Uh-huh.
and fat stands for from animal tissue. No offense to the vegetarians and the vegans in the crowd, but that's, we live in a very challenging world now. But the grass-fed beef liver is a very important, it's probably the richest source of retinol that we can access. I've got 25 vegan clients taking desiccated liver tablets. That's how desperate they are to feel better. Um, we've got cod liver oil. And again, cod liver oil comes in many varieties.
Mm-hmm.
The only two that I really recommend are Rosita's and the Alaskan cod liver oil that Jigsaw sells. Please be very mindful of what I just said. There are only two that I recommend.
Mm-hmm.
And butter. And what people need to understand about butter is not all butters are the same. We know there's a difference between grass-fed and grain-fed. That's a no-brainer.
Right.
We know that's different. Well, grass-fed comes in gradations. You can get grass-fed that only has 12% butter fat. Dr. Liz, my wife, and I were up in Amish country several months ago, and we got introduced to Amish butter, which has 86% butter fat. Very different, much richer, more robust. Mm-hmm. Now, here's something that I didn't know that I think your listeners are going to find fascinating. These fats come in different lengths, and the length of a fat is determined by how many carbons it has inside it.
Okay. And
they start with C3, and I think they go all the way up into the C30s. But there's a very important section called C3 through C8, and C4 is butterfat. But the enzyme that breaks down those C3 through C8 fats, it's about this long. The name of it, ridiculously long. And guess what? It's copper dependent.
Really?
So you can't break down butter if you don't have copper in order to break down the butter fat. And so butter is a very rich source of retinol if it's grass-fed,
okay,
and if it's really very well cared for. Heavy cream. Another very, what's fascinating, one of the things that we did years ago was we bought a cookbook. It's called the Vandy Farmer's Cookbook. It was published back in the 1800s in Boston, early 1800s. And the recipes, Justin, were amazing. All this heavy cream and lard and butter. And I mean, there were foods in there that I'd never heard of.
Yeah.
But our ancestors thrived on these fats. And the soils were very different back then, as you can well imagine. Mm-hmm. And so they had a completely different diet that they wouldn't recognize the food that we eat today. They would be.
Whoops, Morley, are you there? I think we lost you, my friend. Oh my goodness. Well, if you guys are watching, hopefully we'll reconnect with Morley Robbins. He was just talking about the butterfat and the Amish 86% butterfat that's in that. Interesting topic so far, right? I hope you guys are enjoying the show, and we kind of are going through a list of, if you're kind of joining us new, it's my contention that Morley Robbins' work is so vital for us to understand what real health is, and for us to understand what's really going on from a mineral perspective and how iron affects just about every metabolic process in the body. So we're talking about the root cause protocol as it sort of aligns and goes along with different health challenges.